Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Leadership Lounge with Marlowe Foster. Joining us today is Raymond Pierce. Raymond is President and CEO of the Southern Education Foundation in Atlanta, Georgia. As you know, the Leadership Lounge is focused on nonprofit leaders as well as political leaders. Raymond is an individual who can speak to both. In the first part of our two-part interview with Raymond, we'll discuss with him his early years in Cleveland, Ohio, his work in education and education reform, and his time in the Clinton administration. During the second half of our interview with Raymond, we'll focus on his work as president of the Southern Education Foundation. The Southern Education Foundation ensures educational progress for low-income students and students of color in the South. We've been spending the last few weeks talking about nonprofits and nonprofit leadership, and we're transitioning a little bit to political leadership, but we wanted to bring you in right in between because you kind of have done both things in your career. So for our guests, why don't you just start us off with a little bit about your educational background and what drove you into a career in public service?
Well, Marlowe, it's good to have this chat with you, my friend. It's been a long time. And so to get straight to your question, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, Marlowe, born and raised. I attended the Cleveland public schools back in the 60s. And my last 2 years of school, I attended a private school, a private college preparatory school, mostly for the more wealthy people in the city of Cleveland. So here you've got this inner city African-American male who was from an all-black neighborhood, all-black public schools. In my last 2 years, 11th and 12th grade, now out at this predominantly white, wealthy school out in the suburbs. Now, that was kind of interesting because, significant because this is the early mid-70s. And the 60s movement, the feeling of the 60s was still in the air, not just for black folks and the whole James Brown, I say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, but also for whites, also young whites, who were the generation that knew about Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. And of course, we were right there in Cleveland, Ohio, up the road from Kent State University, where the Kent State student killings took place, when those students were protesting the Vietnam War, the whole flower power movement, and the Beatles and, that stuff. So this is my generation. If you were 14, 15, 16 years old then, you had been raised up in this era, with the Vietnam War coming to an end and, all the protests. And so we were students, we were kids of the protest era. There was a huge sense of social responsibility and social progressiveness that was still in the air. And so when I left the Cleveland Public Schools, and our sense of activism was the Black Panthers and the Black Nationalists, the whole
Right.
red, black, green thing.
Right.
I get out to this predominantly white school, and it was mixed up with their, support for Angela Davis and,
Right.
and that whole movement. So it put a brand on me then early on in terms of getting involved in social justice and building a better world. Everybody, my generation, we all loved Bobby Kennedy. We didn't know much about him, but we knew he was somebody, and he had been killed.
Right.
Same time Martin Luther King was killed. We were all 8, 9 years old at that time, and so those were our role models back then. People who were trying to make a change for the better, and that's what I grew into. So I go off to college, and I graduated from Syracuse University. And like a lot of folks, you party your way through college, which I did, and I didn't really get involved in much in terms of social activism. Then once I woke up and realized, hey, I'm going into my 4th year of college, it was like I got to settle down and study and graduate. So it really wasn't much social activism then, as much as it was, having a good time. And then my last year, getting ready to graduate. Then went off to law school, and that was, of course, a grind. Mm-hmm. And I went back to my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, and I attended law school at Case Western Reserve University. And started picking up a little bit then, back then, being reintroduced to issues of social justice. Those were the years, going, the Ronald Reagan years, so to say, the early part of the Ronald Reagan years, and, concern about what the direction the country was going into in terms of issues of social justice. But again, when you're in law school, at least for me, it was, hey, I got to graduate. So
Right.
again, didn't really dig in. But I was mindful of one thing. I did notice this, and this did have an effect on me. My years in law school, I attended law school 1980 to 1983, and the Cleveland school desegregation case had made its way through court through the 70s, and finally in 1980, the city of Cleveland responded in implementing a court order to desegregate the public schools by bringing busing to Cleveland. And I noticed that my impression is in my first year of law school in the inner city of Cleveland, watching kids from the east side of Cleveland, my town, which was predominantly black, standing at the corner waiting on the school buses to take them to the west side. My sense then was that it was not a well thought out plan. That this was just really moving kids around, from one side of town to another. And I could just tell there really wasn't the focus was not so much on equitable education as opposed to mixing the students up, racially balancing the students as with the understanding that somehow that would not only bring about desegregation of the school district, but to also bring about equity in the delivery of quality education. Even then, somebody who didn't know much about education, I just looking at it, I thought, I don't know about that. So I finished law school, and my dad and uncle had moved the family's construction business down to Arkansas, grew it down there. So I decided to take the Arkansas bar exam. So right out of law school, I signed up to take the Arkansas bar exam and got my license. And my very first job was working as a civil rights attorney in Little Rock, Arkansas, with the John W. Walker Law Firm. If you know your history, Mr. Walker, John Walker, is the gentleman who inherited the Little Rock school desegregation cases. The official name, of course, was Cooper versus Allen, that had goes back to the 1950s, and you remember the whole issue with the Little Rock Nine and Miss Daisy Bates, and 9 black children into the all-white Little Rock Central High School, and the governor of Arkansas, Governor Orville Faubus, called out the National Guard, the state National Guard, to prevent the kids from going to the school, and President Dwight David Eisenhower called out the federal marshals to escort these kids into school. All that happened in Little Rock in 1954. 1959, following the Little Rock, the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. Well, that litigation, that case that Thurgood Marshall and Wiley Brandt and those gentlemen launched in Little Rock was inherited ultimately by John Walker. He carried it on, and that's the firm where I went to work right out of law school.
Now, when you talk, right, so that's really interesting, because I want to go back a little bit to your time in Cleveland. So you were in Cleveland Public School, and then you went to a private school, and then you transitioned to Little Rock, and you see everything going on in the educational environment. Did that early part of your life, the transition from public to private, and what I would assume to be you mostly in a public school that was at least 50-50 or maybe 70-30, much more diverse, to a private school where I'm sure there was a lack of diversity. Did any of that change your views on education, right and wrong, and did it inform the work you did in Arkansas as you took on this task at the law firm?
Well, let's see. Let me help inform that the school district, the schools that I attended, and the public schools I attended, were probably 95% black, maybe 98% African American when I was there. A very small amount of white students, and no Hispanics, no Latino, I mean, again, this is Cleveland, Ohio, in the
Right.
70s. And then I go to a private school out in the suburbs, which was probably 98% white.
Right. Right.
So it's just total flip. Now, I guess I just am the type of person, I probably get this from my dad, that, get along with everybody. And I wasn't intimidated by anybody. I was new to the school,
Mm-hmm.
but, a lot of those white children students became my good friends, even
Right.
to this day.
Mm-hmm.
But it was clear that those schools had resources and exposure to opportunities that we didn't have
Right.
on the east side of Cleveland, the public
Right.
schools at that time.
Right.
I mean, we had great teachers, I felt, in the public schools, but didn't have the resources that I saw out there. So if it influenced my thinking at all, it told me that it was more about the resources.
Right.
That was my focus, was the resources. I always felt that, I'm all for, a diverse community, but, at the same time, let's get the resources to the students. And so that was if anything, that's what I took to the civil rights. I brought into my civil rights practice, and that is, the equity with regard to, okay, let's make sure that, there's no distinction in terms of as best you can,
Right.
in terms of the resources for educating students.
So I want to get to the Southern Education Foundation, but I kind of want to use your time in the Clinton administration as a little transition to SEF. And so you were in the Clinton administration from 1993 to 2000. You had this history in Little Rock of championing the cause of civil rights and education reform. So can you talk a little bit about how you got involved with President Clinton and what you did in the Department of Education and how you felt about your most significant achievements there?
Well, okay, let's take that in order. Well, I got involved, of course, with the administration because of my activity in Little Rock. I mean, Bill Clinton was the governor back then, and a significant part of the team that ultimately went with the president to the White House in Washington, D.C. were in existence right there in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were just the folks there in Little Rock that I knew. I mean, from Bruce Lindsay and Bob Nash and Rodney Slater and guys like that, they were just all around. It was Nancy, I forget her name, his secretary. She's good people, good person. Mac McLarty was like one of the pillars of the society, down there. He ultimately became chief of staff and then I think U.S. Trade Representative, but he was the president of Arkansas Power and Light Company. He was, the CEO of the utility company there. And of course, you go to a reception, any civic organization throws a reception, the corporate community shows up. So, Mac McLarty was always around. People like Vince Foster, unfortunately, Mr. Foster, lost his life, while we were at the administration. But I remember Vince Foster in Little Rock as one of the prominent attorneys there at the Rose Law Firm. He was just a giant of a man back then. So all these guys were just, they were just around. And so as years later, when the governor starts running for president, they were part of the team, and so when I got to Washington, they were there. So that was my introduction. And as for the work I was able to do, when I was with John Walker in Little Rock, even though Mr. Walker and the firm, held most of the major school desegregation cases still in existence in that part of the country, not just in Arkansas, but over in Oklahoma and parts of Texas. Not only did he have those cases, but he also had the major class action employment discrimination cases, the Title VII cases. We had those, and those were the cases of which I worked, the big railroad cases in particular, and prosecuting those claims for discriminating against African Americans in terms of employment, hiring, promotions, transfers, terminations, all of that. But of course, my interest was in education. So when I get to Washington, D.C., and in between that, I had gone back to my hometown of Cleveland, and I was, even though I was in a corporate capacity as an attorney at a pretty big company there, I still was a volunteer with the local NAACP branch,
Okay.
and I chaired the education committee. And I got in the news for some work I was doing in terms of resolving the Cleveland school desegregation case through the NAACP. And I was in the news at a time when Governor Clinton, when I think he had won the nomination. He was going into the general election, and he had come through Cleveland. And I was having breakfast with a friend of mine from Little Rock, and he saw me in the newspaper, and he said, "Raymond, that's what the governor will want you to do if we take the White House." And so they won, and they brought me into the civil rights world for the federal government. And I'm glad, because we were able to, even though I went there with the thought to focus on K-12, I got there and was immediately thrown into the higher ed world, higher education world. But at the same time was able to, going into the second term, get on top of some issues, K-12 issues, particularly in terms of tracking of students into lower track courses, and the civil rights issues around that, resource comparability, the E-rate. I was able to work on the E-rate with the Federal Communications Commission to get schools and libraries internet capability in the early years of the internet into the inner cities and rural parts of the country. I'm really proud of that. I was able to work on the White House Domestic Policy Council for the creation of the empowerment zones for economic development and workforce development. We were able to initiate the first policy in support of public school innovation. At that time, was called charter schools. Earlier, Bill Clinton campaigned on that issue. There were only 3 charter schools in existence at that time, and the idea was that we should get some federal policies in support of allowing more charter schools as a way of allowing people to go off without all the restrictions of traditional public education and experiment in some models and pedagogy to improve educational attainment levels. Unfortunately, some of that has gotten out of hand, and we can talk about that later. That's one thing we're going to be addressing here at the Southern Education Foundation. But I'm really proud of that work. And issues of high standards education, the policies we put out on that. We got a lot done. I mean, Secretary Riley was Secretary of Education and former governor of South Carolina, actually 2-time governor of South Carolina. He was our leader, hands down the greatest Secretary of Education I think this country's ever had. And to have been able to be on his team during those times, it was just fantastic. We got so much done, of which to this day I'm very proud.
We hope you enjoyed the first part of our interview with Raymond Pierce. Join us next week as we really dive deep into his work at the Southern Education Foundation. This is the Leadership Lounge with Marlowe Foster.